Hello and welcome to today's video lesson. It is on gas exchange and transport. So the learning goals for today are to firstly explain the relationship between the structural features, this is structure and function, of the respiratory system. That is, large surface area, has to be moist, it's going to be really thin, only 1 or 2 cells thick, and how these structures support the function of gaseous exchange. This occurs at the sites of alveoli in mammals, in our lungs, and gills in fish. So what are we exchanging? We're getting oxygen in and CO2 out. Also, to explain the structure and function of capillaries, how they facilitate the exchange of materials, and they can include water, oxygen, CO2, as well as other things, between our inside, our internal environment, and the cells within. So you can pause the video here, just write a summarized version of those goals. Let's get into it. So first up, structure and function of gaseous surfaces. A couple of key terms from your textbook here. When we're talking about gaseous exchange, we are referring to the respiratory system. And the main function of the respiratory system is to take oxygen in and to get CO2 out. So animals have figured this out in a number of different ways. Worms, for example, they use simple diffusion where their skin is the respiratory surface. They actually absorb oxygen from the air through their skin and get CO2 out in the same way. And if you've ever picked up a worm, you would know that they are very moist to hold. And that's because moisture facilitates the dissolving of substances in the process of diffusion. Insects, however, have another feature, and as you can see in the diagram, they're called spiracles. They are essentially holes on the surface of their body that are connected to tubes, which are connected to more tubes, and they just branch and get smaller to they eventually reach the cellular level. So to summarize 2 key features that are required for gas exchange to occur, the surface must be moist and there needs to be a large surface area. The 2 main systems that we will look at now, where we see these features at play, are in the gills of fish and the lungs within mammals. So let's start with the gills of fish. Fish live in an area that is really moist, so they don't have to worry about that moist membrane problem. Their gills just sit in the water. But there's another problem. They live in an area where there isn't much oxygen at all. So they have to be really efficient at exchanging oxygen. There's something like 4 to 8 parts of oxygen per million in the water. That's 4 to 8 parts per million. But we have our lungs that are folded up inside of our body to keep them moist, to avoid dehydrating. But there is so much more oxygen in the air around us, so we don't actually have to be as efficient as extracting oxygen from our environment as do fish. Fish gills are efficient at doing this. We believe they can extract about 80% of the oxygen that is in the water, which is just really efficient. The way they do this is using what is called concurrent exchange. This basically means that as blood flows through the gills, it flows in the opposite direction to the way that the water is flowing over the gills, and that just means there's a constant concentration gradient between blood and the water, resulting in optimal diffusion. The counter to this, the opposite, is concurrent exchange. And if you think about this, if water is flowing in the same direction as the blood, that same blood is in contact with that same water, and only a little bit of diffusion will occur until equilibrium is reached. But if water is flowing in the opposite direction as the blood, new water is constantly meeting new blood. So there's a constant concentration gradient where the water has more oxygen and the blood has more CO2. So this is constant swapping occurring where high concentration moves to low concentration. So engineers use countercurrent exchange quite a fair bit, and we see it at play within nature most efficiently as well. So notice in this image though of the fish, where you look at the filaments here, there's actually big bunches, and that's because when a fish is taken out of water, all those filaments, they just clump, they bunch together. So that is why a fish suffocates. When it is out of the water, the surface area of those filaments is drastically reduced. So if we talk now about the process of gas exchange in humans, we have a different system. We have the lungs, as do other mammals, where it starts with the trachea, the windpipe, which goes down into the bronchi, which branches off into bronchioles, and finally we have the alveoli. Notice it's a one-way path. When we breathe in, generally what comes in stays in. So if people are working around, so air will come back out, but if particles in that settle, such as like asbestos or coal dust or even nicotine from smoking it builds up in our lungs. We do have cilia in our windpipe, which are these finger-like projections that push gunk out, but still. So you can think of our lungs as basically an upside-down tree, where it just branches and branches. Here is an X-ray image, and again you can see that branching occurring, and the whole point of this is like the filaments in a fish. It is to increase surface area. More surface area means more gas exchange can occur. The site of gas exchange is the alveoli, and this is because as we inhale in oxygen, it branches down to these tiny little features called the alveoli, where they're surrounded by capillaries, and so there's a concentration gradient where the alveoli are rich in oxygen, so it's going to diffuse out of the alveoli into the blood, but the blood is also rich in CO2, so it goes from high concentration to low concentration and moves into the alveoli, where it can then be exhaled. And alveoli are really thin, they're only about 1 to 2 cells thick. They are moist and they have a large surface area, allowing for optimal diffusion to take place. They say if we flattened out the area of our lungs or our alveoli, it would reach about the area of a tennis court. So this is how our structural features, they relate to our function and allow for efficient gas exchange to occur in mammals and in fish through the process of concurrent exchange. So if we move on to structure and function of capillaries, I'm going to talk for a moment about the structure and function of our blood vessels, thinking always how does structure relate to function, focusing on the capillary system. So we have arteries, and they carry blood that is just coming out of the heart. Those arteries then branch into arterioles, and if you think of where is this blood coming from, it's coming from a pump, which means there's a fair bit of pressure. They have multiple layers and they're quite muscly, they're quite thick to withstand that pressure, as opposed to veins, which are actually much thinner because they simply aren't under as much pressure when returning blood to the heart. The capillaries, though, is where all the action really happens. So the capillaries branch and branch until they get really, really small. They've actually got a diameter of about 5 micrometers, which is about the same diameter as a red blood vessel. We know that red blood vessels carry oxygen, so again, that oxygen doesn't have to move far at all as it passes through our capillaries and into the nearby cells. So here's another image just showing, well, we have alveoli surrounded by capillaries where oxygen moves from a high area to a low area, CO2 moves from a low area into the alveoli so that gas exchange can occur. However, gas exchange is only one example of the various materials that do move in and out of our capillaries. We also transport water through our body. We also need to transport nutrients such as sugar. We obtain glucose from our diet. It is broken down and it is absorbed from our digestive system into our blood, because if you remember cellular respiration, it's this whole process of making energy, but the inputs are glucose and oxygen. So that's why we need to get them into every cell in our body. We also have different byproducts that are produced, such as carbon dioxide, that we need to get out through this process of diffusion, where it is then exhaled. But also other ions like potassium and sodium. We obtain a lot of potassium from our bananas, so these kind of things that we get from our foods, we need to get those into our bodies. And capillaries is the site of exchange, and their structure being so thin, having that ability to allow for simple diffusion, makes them a very important feature of our bodies. So that is all as far as content goes. You might want to watch over this video a couple of times, or if you're supporting this with your readings and the discussions we're doing in class and the notes that you're taking, you might be all good. But I just want to finish with a couple of photos. So here is an image. It's an electron micrograph showing the alveolar region of the lungs of a mammal. It's actually taken from that of a dog, just showing the architecture, how all these little walls just increased our surface area. Often we think of our lungs like a balloon, but they're more like a sponge. And we again see that here in this micrograph. And just an interesting side fact, over time, when people continue to smoke for years and years, what it does is it actually breaks down the elastin, this alveolar wall-like architecture in our lungs, therefore significantly decreasing surface area. And we know that surface area is important for gas exchange. So that's why people who have been smoking find it difficult to breathe. They're not getting as much oxygen. And one clinical symptom that I learned about in paramedics was identifying people with this condition called emphysema when they breathe with pursed lips. It's called pursed lip breathing. What they do is they essentially do that, and it narrows the passage of air coming in to basically increase the pressure of air, because when our alveolar break down, we also lose that ability to push air out. So it's just this way of compensating for all this broken down alveolar region that cigarette smokers can often suffer from. But that is all for today's video. I hope that you have found it informative and interesting, and I look forward to our presentations in class on this topic. So God bless. I'll see you soon.